Julian's hand came out of nowhere. Not fast, not dramatic, just enough force to knock my head sideways into the edge of my father's oak bookcase. The sound was dull, wood against bone. For a moment, everything went quiet. I tasted blood, metallic, familiar. It mixed with the smell of floor polish and my father's pipe tobacco, still lingering in his office even 3 days after his funeral. Julian stood over me, breathing hard. His face was flushed, his jaw tight. In his hand was a stack of legal papers, crushed into a useless mess. "Sign it, Nora," he said. His voice was low, controlled. "Sign it now, or I'll have you off this farm before sunset." Behind him, Lydia sat in my father's leather armchair. She dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, Hermes, the kind she reserved for performances. "Nora, dear," she said softly, too softly, "you're just an accountant. Your place is in the back office, not in the chairman's seat of Vance Logistics." She smiled as she said it, like she was offering advice. They both assumed the same thing, that because my father had been gone for 3 days, everything already belonged to them. The house, the land, the company, the $25 million he'd spent his life building. I stayed on the floor a moment longer than necessary, not because I was hurt, because I was listening. That's when my phone vibrated inside my coat pocket. Just once. Short. Precise. I didn't reach for it right away. Julian mistook my silence for fear. Lydia mistook it for defeat. When I finally stood, my head was ringing, but my hands were steady. I checked the message. It was from the oldest law firm in Boston, the one my father had trusted for 40 years. Safe code activated, it read. "Welcome, Madam Chairwoman. Eleanor Nora Vance." I looked up. Julian was still glaring at me. Lydia was already smiling, certain she'd won. And for the first time in years, I smiled back. Not because they were wrong, but because the long game had finally reached its first move. Before any of this happened, before lawyers and documents and threats, there was the farm. A horse farm in rural Virginia. White fences, early mornings, the kind of place people imagined when they said words like legacy. Julian loved that word, legacy. He said it like it already belonged to him. I was different. I was practical, which, in my family, was another way of saying forgettable. Julian was the star, the charming one, the future face of Vance Logistics. I was the one who showed up early and stayed late, the one who noticed when numbers didn't add up, the one who fixed problems quietly so no one else had to see them. My father noticed, but not the way people assume. When I turned 18, he didn't send me to a corner office or a training program. He sent me to the warehouse. 6 a.m. starts, inventory sheets, forklift certifications. "You need to learn the value of $1, he told me once, watching me log shipment counts with frozen fingers, "before you ever get to decide what to do with one." So I learned, from the ground up. I moved from loading docks to dispatch, from dispatch to payroll, from payroll to accounting. I learned where money was made, and more importantly, where it disappeared. Julian never learned that part. While I was reconciling fuel invoices, Julian was in Atlantic City, company card in his pocket, casino chips stacked like trophies. While I was reviewing maintenance costs, Julian was signing lease agreements. Porsche. Another Porsche. Always leased. Always temporary. He called it image. I called it debt. I wore clothes from Target. Neutral colors. Nothing memorable. Not because I couldn't afford more, because every dollar I didn't spend stayed inside the company. Julian didn't believe in restraint. He believed in appearances. Designer suits, luxury watches, expense filed under client development. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit alone in the accounting office and reverse charges he hoped no one would notice. Sometimes, I left them. Patterns tell stories if you let them. Julian hated me for that, for seeing things. "You're just furniture," he snapped at me once during an argument in the farmhouse living room. Old wood, dusty books, old, boring furniture no one even looks at anymore. He said it like an insult. I heard it like a warning. The favoritism was never subtle. At Julian's college graduation, there was a party. Catered. Loud. Public. My father handed him a box in front of everyone. A Rolex. Heavy. Gold. Applause followed. When I graduated, I received a letter. Not in public. Not framed. A handwritten note about discipline. About savings. About how real power came from patience. I folded it carefully and kept it. Julian laughed at me for that. He thought letters were cheap. What he didn't understand was that my father wasn't preparing me to be admired. He was preparing me to survive, and eventually to take control. At the time, I didn't know why I was being trained this way. I just knew I was being watched differently, not celebrated, measured. While Julian burned money to feel important, I learned how to track it. While he demanded attention, I learned how to disappear. By the time my father died, everyone believed the same thing. Julian was the heir. I was the background. And that belief is exactly what made everything else possible. The house had been empty for years, not abandoned, just forgotten. The old Virginia place sat back from the road, hidden behind trees that had grown wild without anyone correcting them. Julian hated it, said it smelled like dust and ghosts. Lydia refused to step inside, said it gave her headaches. That alone should have told me something. I went there 3 nights after the reading of the will, alone. No lights on except the one over the kitchen sink. My father, Arthur, had been meticulous about many things: records, ledgers, dates, but sentimental in exactly one place, the fireplace. It was original oak, hand-carved, never replaced. He used to stand there on winter mornings, pipe in hand, staring into embers that barely burned. When I was a child, he once told me some things were meant to stay hidden until the right person came looking. I found the seam behind the left panel. It wasn't obvious. It never would be. I pressed. The panel shifted, and there it was, a safe. Old steel, scratched, untouched. The keypad was simple, 6 digits. I didn't hesitate. I entered my mother's birthday. Not the year she died, not the day she married my father. The day she was born. The date Julian never remembered. The date Lydia never bothered to learn. The lock clicked open on the first try. Inside were folders. No jewelry, no cash, just paper. And weight. The first folder held bank transfers, internal accounts, employee retirement funds. I sat on the floor and read every line. Over $2.4 million had been siphoned out of the company pension plan over 3 years. Small withdrawals, spread carefully, routed through shell vendors that billed for consulting. Julian's signature was everywhere. Not forged. Confident. The second folder held emails. Requests he'd denied publicly. Approvals he'd granted privately. The third folder changed everything. A notarized document. Stamped, logged, filed. The real will. Signed 1 month before my father died. It named me as sole controlling trustee of Vance Logistics. It removed Julian entirely. It revoked every power Lydia believed she held. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't tighten. I felt calm. Under the will was a letter, written in my father's hand. Short, direct, precise. He wrote that he knew. That his heart medication had been altered. Small doses, gradual changes. Enough to weaken. Enough to confuse. Enough to kill without suspicion. He wrote that the toxicology would never show it unless someone looked for exactly the right compound. He wrote that he had looked. And then he wrote about Lydia. 3 marriages before him, 3 husbands, all dead within 2 years, all ruled sudden heart failure, all on similar medications. He said he had been careful after he realized, careful enough to finish what he needed to finish, careful enough to leave me what mattered. The last page was just one sentence. Don't let them win, Nora. You have the heart of a Vance. I closed the safe and sat there for a long time. The firebox was cold, the house silent. Julian thought power came from noise, from taking, from being seen. Lydia thought it came from patience, from smiling, from poison administered slowly enough to look like fate. My father understood something else. Power came from preparation, from memory, from knowing exactly who would be left standing when the truth finally arrived. I locked the safe again. Then I took the documents, and for the first time since Arthur Vance was buried, I wasn't reacting. I was moving. I didn't go home after leaving the old house. I went back to the farm. Rain had already started by the time I turned onto the gravel drive. Hard rain, the kind that erases footprints and encourages bad decisions. Julian had moved fast. That was the first thing I noticed. The lights were on in the main house, every window bright, too bright, like a stage set. The second thing I noticed was the silence. No horses, no stable hands, no familiar sounds. When I stepped onto the porch, my key didn't work. New lock. I tried the side door. Same thing. Behind me, the rain picked up. Wind pushed it sideways, stinging my face. Then the door opened. Julian stood there, dry, relaxed, smiling like someone who had already rehearsed this moment. Lydia was behind him, wrapped in a cashmere shawl that didn't belong anywhere near a farm. "Looking for something?" she asked softly. I didn't answer. Julian stepped aside just enough for me to see the living room. Drawers open, cabinet doors hanging, a jewelry box on the coffee table. Empty. Lydia sighed and shook her head. "After everything your father did for you," she said, "I never imagined you'd sink this low." She held up a velvet tray, my mother's necklace, the one that had been missing for years. "I found this in your room," she continued, "packed so carelessly. I almost admired it, the timing, the props, the certainty." Julian moved past me and walked down the porch steps. I followed his gaze. My suitcase lay in the grass, open, clothes soaked through, papers scattered. He'd thrown everything out into the storm. "Sign the papers," Julian said, holding out a folder. 20 grand. Clean break. "Generous," I said. Lydia leaned closer, her voice dropping. "You were never meant to be here," she whispered. "You were just one of Arthur's mistakes." That was when Julian laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Get out," he said. "Find a ditch somewhere and disappear. You're broke. You're nothing." I looked at both of them. Neither noticed that I wasn't shaking. I turned and walked away. Not fast, not dramatic. I left them standing there, convinced the storm had finished me. They didn't follow. They didn't need to. Or so they thought. I drove until the rain softened into mist, and the lights of the farm disappeared behind me. 10 miles down the road, I pulled into a diner that had been there longer than the highway. 1 story, neon sign, coffee that tasted burned. I slid into a booth near the window. The waitress didn't ask questions. She brought coffee and a plate of fries like she'd seen this before. That's where I sat when Lydia's next move began. By morning, rumors were already circulating. A troubled daughter, stealing, unstable, disrespectful. She'd hired a private investigator, cheap, sloppy, the kind who took photos out of context and whispered them into the right ears. By Sunday, people at church were avoiding me. By Tuesday, I was no longer invited to charity meetings. Lydia called it containment. I called it exposure. Because while they were focused on pushing me out, they weren't watching where they stepped. I spread the papers across the diner table. The pension withdrawals, the real will, the letter. I ordered another coffee. I started making calls. Not loud ones, not threatening ones, just precise ones. Accountants, regulators, people who understood numbers better than excuses. Julian and Lydia believed the farm was the battlefield. It wasn't. The diner was. Because this was where I stopped reacting and started deciding exactly how the end of their story would read. The diner became my office. Same booth, same waitress, same chipped mug refilled without asking. That was where the old names started resurfacing. Not the loud ones, the forgotten ones. The first call I made was to Margie. Margaret Holloway, 73, retired chief accountant. She answered on the third ring, voice steady, like she'd been waiting for something to go wrong. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. Margie had built the original accounting system back when Vance Logistics still ran on servers that hummed louder than the trucks. She remembered passwords no one else had bothered to change. She remembered where numbers were supposed to land before Julian learned how to reroute them. "They never revoked my access," she added calmly. "People forget the boring parts." The second call was to Gary Garrison, 72, family attorney, office that smelled like dust and leather-bound law. His shelves were lined with statutes no one cited anymore. His desk was scarred from decades of elbows leaning into difficult conversations. "I told Arthur not to marry her," he said without preamble. "Didn't listen then, either." Gary still had friends in probate, in banking oversight, in places where patience mattered more than volume. The third call wasn't really a call. It was a visit. My grandmother Dorothy answered the door holding a coin purse she'd owned longer than I'd been alive. 80 years old, still counted cash by hand, still folded receipts. She didn't ask why I was there. She just said, "I never trusted that woman," and put the kettle on. She'd kept copies of everything. Letters, holiday cards, bank slips Arthur never threw away. She called it paper memory. My Aunt Catherine came next. She lived 2 states away. Always had. Always watched Lydia from a distance that made patterns easier to see. She mailed me a box. Inside were death certificates, marriage licenses, hospital discharge summaries. Different states, same ending, sudden heart failure. 2 years in, every time. By the end of the week, we had a table. Not literal, digital. Margie, Gary, Dorothy, Catherine. We joked once and called ourselves the Betrayed Club. No membership fees, just receipts. Margie pulled logs from the old system. Gary cross-checked legal timelines. Dorothy scanned documents with a machine she didn't trust but learned anyway. Catherine tracked public records across state lines. I coordinated, quietly. And then Margie paused. "Nora," she said, "there's something else." Julian's accounts showed payments that weren't luxury or entertainment. They were fear, cash advances, unsecured transfers, short repayment windows. $1.2 million. Football betting, not casual, compulsive. The names attached to the debts weren't banks. They weren't patient. Gary leaned back in his chair when he saw the list. "That explains the urgency," he said. "The forced signatures, the lock changes, the panic." Julian wasn't just reckless, he was cornered. We agreed on one rule. Let them believe they'd won. Let Lydia enjoy her reputation repair. Let Julian posture. Let them grow careless. Because people who think the threat is gone stop watching the door. And doors, once left unguarded, open themselves. By the time the paperwork moved, Vance Logistics was already bleeding. Fuel contracts renegotiated badly. Fleet upgrades delayed too long. Credit stretched thin and patience thinner. Julian told the board it was temporary. Market conditions, supply chains, excuses that sounded impressive until you put numbers next to them. The truth was simpler. He didn't know how to run what he'd inherited. That's where the Boston Fund came in. Quiet name, old address, clean website with nothing flashy and everything reassuring. They didn't buy companies, they bought debt. specifically distressed debt. They offered to take on Vance Logistics liabilities. Not cheap, not generous. Just enough to feel like rescue. Enough to make Julian breathe again. Gary reviewed the structure. Margie smiled when she saw the clauses. Dorothy said nothing and folded another receipt. Julian signed fast. He didn't read the footnotes. Didn't notice the conversion triggers. Didn't question why the guarantor language included personal liability under specific circumstances. Why would he? He thought he'd won. He announced the strategic partnership at a press conference with borrowed confidence and a rented suit. Said the future was secure. Said critics had been wrong. That night, he bought a yacht. White. Leased. Named Second Chance. He posted photos from the marina. Champagne. Sunset. Hashtags about freedom. 2 days later, his corporate card stopped working. He didn't panic at first. Assumed it was a system error. By the time he called the bank, the answer was already waiting. Accounts frozen. Covenants triggered. Personal guarantees activated. The debt he'd pushed aside was now standing directly behind him. The anniversary gala went on anyway. 50 years of Vance Logistics. Crystal glasses. Printed programs with Arthur's name embossed in gold. I attended. Not announced. Not invited. I wore a simple dress. Navy. Flat shoes. No jewelry worth noticing. The room noticed anyway. Julian saw me across the floor and laughed, loud enough for people to turn. Here to pour drinks, he asked, or beg for rent money? A few people smiled. Most looked uncomfortable. I didn't respond. I waited. Because this wasn't my entrance. It was my timing. When the board chair stepped up to speak, the room quieted. She thanked investors, praised leadership, mentioned the Boston Fund. That was my cue. I stood, introduced myself, not as family, not as staff, as the fund's legal representative. I watched recognition spread slowly, like ink in water. Julian's smile didn't disappear at once. It cracked first. I explained the terms, the debt conversion, the compliance failures. I explained that effective immediately, the fund controlled the company's obligations, and that under the agreement he'd signed, his personal assets were no longer separate. Silence has weight when it settles all at once. Julian tried to speak. Couldn't. Someone in the back whispered the yacht's name. I finished calmly, thanked the room for their time, said the fund valued transparency. Then I sat back down. I didn't look at Julian again. I didn't need to. The trap had closed the moment he believed he was safe. The Monarch Hotel had always been careful about appearances. Polished marble, muted gold lighting, staff trained to pretend they didn't recognize power until it introduced itself. That morning, the ballroom was full. Partners, investors, people who had learned to read balance sheets like weather reports. They thought this was a restructuring meeting. Another announcement. Another explanation wrapped in optimism. They didn't know who owned the room. I sat near the back. Not hidden, just unremarkable. Navy dress again, flat shoes, a folder on my lap I didn't open. Gary Garrison arrived late. Not rushed, not apologetic. He walked in carrying the same leather briefcase he'd used for 30 years, corners worn smooth, handle darkened by time. It looked out of place among sleek laptops and glass water bottles. He stopped at the front, cleared his throat. I'm here to request the formal disclosure of Arthur Vance's final will, he said. A murmur moved through the room. Julian stood halfway from his chair. Lydia turned slowly, like she already knew the direction of the wind. Gary didn't look at them. He handed documents to the moderator, stamped, notarized. The screens came alive, not spreadsheets, video. My father sat in his study, the old one, fireplace behind him, pipe unlit in his hand. His voice was steady. He spoke about the medication, about the changes, about the certainty. He spoke about Lydia, about patterns, about silence that lasted too long to be coincidence. No drama, no accusation, just facts. When the video ended, no one clapped, no one breathed. Gary nodded once. Then the packets were passed out. Printed summaries, bank trails, pension fund withdrawals. Julian's name appeared again and again. Dates, amounts, signatures. Someone near the front whispered a number. 40 million. That was the total exposure. Converted. Guaranteed. Julian looked down at his hands. He tried to laugh. Failed. He opened his mouth to speak. That was when the doors opened. 2 officers first, then 4 more. No rush, no shouting. Lydia stood. "This is outrageous," she said. "You can't—" They didn't argue. They moved. One toward Julian, one toward Lydia. Julian dropped to his knees. Not dramatically, just suddenly, as if his legs had received information the rest of him hadn't yet processed. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't read—" No one answered. Lydia didn't scream. She went quiet. That was how I knew she understood exactly what was happening. As they led her away, she looked at me for the first time that day. Not angry, not afraid. Calculating. I held her gaze. Didn't blink. The room stayed still long after the doors closed. The Monarch Hotel had seen many things. It had never seen truth arrive without asking permission. I stood. Walked past tables filled with people who had once dismissed me. No one spoke. Outside, the air felt lighter. Not victorious. Complete. The long game had ended, and the silence behind me was finally honest. The unraveling wasn't loud. It was procedural. The farm went first. Appraised, sealed. Horses moved before sunrise by people who didn't ask questions. Then the cars, the ones Julian loved because they reflected him back the way he preferred to be seen. Flatbeds arrived. Clipboards came out. Keys changed hands. Those assets didn't disappear. They were redirected. Retirement accounts were restored. Back pay issued. Checks mailed to employees who had spent years trusting a name on the side of a truck. Some of them cried when they opened the envelopes. Some didn't. Justice doesn't always look like celebration. Lydia tried to erase herself. In the courthouse hallway, she reached into her purse and snapped her phone in half. A clean break. Too late. Dorothy moved faster than anyone expected. 80 years old, leather handbag, no hesitation. The sound was sharp, final. The phone slid across the tile like it wanted to escape. Security took over. Dorothy adjusted her coat and said nothing. Julian's girlfriend didn't wait. Tiffany, 24, new apartment, new promises. She vanished the same hour the accounts froze, left behind clothes, makeup, silence. People who love money don't love people who lose it. The sentences came later. They always do. Julian received 25 years in federal prison. Financial fraud, employee theft, conspiracy. Lydia received life. Intent, pattern, proof. There were no speeches, no tears, just numbers read into record. I attended none of it. I saw Julian once after, through glass. Orange uniform, hair cropped short, hands that didn't know what to do without something to hold. He worked in the prison library, 14 cents an hour, shelving books written by people who understood consequences better than he ever had. He didn't look angry. He looked small. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said. I didn't respond. He tried again. "We were family." That was when I spoke. "Family isn't blood," I said. "It's choice. And you chose wrong." He nodded, not in agreement, in acceptance. I left. The farm is quiet now, fields resting, fences repaired by people paid fairly to do it. The company still runs, different leadership, different rules. I kept nothing I didn't earn. The old house was sold, the fireplace left intact. Sometimes I think about the moment Julian laughed on the porch in the rain, about how convinced he was that night. Confidence is dangerous when it isn't earned. Dorothy still keeps receipts, still counts cash, still believes memory is protection. Margie sends postcards. Gary finally retired. Catherine planted a garden. As for me, I sleep well, not because I won, because I finished. Greed collapses under its own weight eventually. It always has. The only variable is who has the patience to step aside and let it fall. Recovery is quieter than collapse. There are no sirens, no headlines at first, just decisions made correctly, one after another. The first thing I did was restore what had been taken. 47 names, men and women who had shown up every morning for decades and trusted the wrong people at the top. Payroll balances corrected, pension funds replenished, interest accounted for. I signed every authorization myself. Some of them came to my office afterward. Not to thank me, to explain that they hadn't expected it, that they'd already adjusted their lives to loss. That was the part that stayed with me. Expectation is the real theft. The foundation came next. We called it the Vance Legacy Fund. Not for branding, for accuracy. It supports elderly people who've been financially abused. Quiet grants, legal assistance, counseling. No press releases, no donor walls, just help where it's needed most. Dorothy reviewed the bylaws. Gary approved the language. Margie audited the first year personally. The farm took longer. We didn't restore it to what it had been. We changed its purpose. The fences stayed, the barns stayed, but the fields became therapy space. Horses trained for calm, for patience, for children who needed both. The first time I watched a child who couldn't speak press his forehead against a horse's neck and breathe easier, I understood something my father never said out loud. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you stop repeating. The wedding was small, local church, wooden pews, no announcements. He wore a simple suit. I wore a dress my grandmother would have approved of. No excess, no spectacle. He'd saved my life years earlier after a crash no one remembered now, treated me without asking who I was or what I owned. That mattered. We said our vows quietly, the kind meant to last. Forbes came later, a photographer, a title. An underestimated heir saves a logistics empire. I didn't frame it. The magazine sits in a drawer I rarely open. Because the real work doesn't look like a cover. It looks like restored trust, like a stable morning routine, like checks arriving on time. Sometimes people ask if I feel satisfied. I don't use that word. I feel aligned. The company runs, the foundation grows, the farm heals, and every once in a while, when the house is quiet, I think about the safe behind the fireplace, about how many years it waited, about how close everything came to being lost. Patience isn't passive, it's precise. And legacy, real legacy, belongs to the people who remember that. I visit my father in the mornings, not out of habit, out of clarity. The cemetery is quiet before noon. Dew still clings to the grass. Birds argue softly in the trees like they always have. I bring him black coffee in a paper cup, the way he drank it. No sugar, no apology. I set it on the stone. I don't speak right away. I bring the paper too, folded, creased. The article sits above the fold. Vance Logistics reports record stability, employee retention at historic highs, long-term growth projected without risk exposure. He would have liked the wording. I tell him that. I tell him the company is calm now, that no one is afraid to open an email, that numbers line up because people are allowed to tell the truth again. I don't tell him everything. Some things don't need witnesses. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. No return address I recognized at first. Federal Correctional Facility. Block handwriting. I didn't open it immediately. I let it sit on the counter beside the mail I actually needed. Bills, notices, invitations I politely declined. When I did open it, it was short. Apologies usually are when they're written too late. He said he was sorry. He said he'd had time to think. He said he hoped one day we could talk. I put it back in the envelope, wrote 3 words across the front. No one by that name lives here, and mailed it back. Not out of cruelty, out of accuracy. There are names we grow out of. There are roles we stop answering to. Revenge was never the point. People misunderstand that. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's irrelevance. Living so fully, so deliberately, that the people who tried to erase you become background noise you no longer register. That's not forgiveness. It's release. The evenings are my favorite now. The farm porch faces west, the kind of view that doesn't rush you. Grass rolling into distance, light stretching before it fades. I stand there sometimes with one hand resting on my stomach, feeling movement, potential, a future that doesn't know any of these names yet. The doctors say everything looks good, steady, strong. I think about how close everything came to ending before it began, about how silence once nearly cost me everything. But silence isn't weakness. It's storage. It's where truth waits until it's needed. The sun dips lower. The fields glow. The horses settle. I breathe. And if there's one thing I would leave behind, if there's one thing worth remembering, it's this. The quietest people in the room are often the ones holding the key. Not to power, to direction. They don't announce it. They don't threaten. They wait. And when the moment comes, they open the door and step through it, without looking back.